What if I told you that throughout history, some of the world's most elegant dinner parties ended with guests writhing in agony, foaming at the mouth, or glowing radioactively in the dark? Tonight, we're uncovering the meals that should have come with warning labels. From Roman banquets that became mass murder scenes to Japanese delicacies that paralyzed samurai, and modern foods that literally poisoned entire generations. Before we dive into these culinary nightmares, smash that like button if you're brave enough to hear what's coming, and subscribe if you want more stories that'll make you grateful for your boring Tuesday leftovers. Trust me, after tonight, you'll never look at your dinner the same way again. Now dim those lights, maybe push that plate away for a moment, and let's explore the meals that history tried to forget. Think of it like a medieval buffet, 8 chapters, each one a different flavor of misery. Chapter 1: The Roman Banquet that became a bloodbath picture. You're a wealthy Roman citizen in 44 BCE, and you've just received an invitation to what promises to be the social event of the season. The host is known for his extravagant parties, his exotic ingredients shipped from the far corners of the empire, and his flair for the dramatic. What could possibly go wrong? Everything, as it turns out. Roman dining wasn't just about food. It was theatre, politics, and social warfare, all served on silver platters. The wealthy competed to see who could present the most outrageous delicacies, the most shocking entertainment, and the most memorable evening. Sometimes memorable meant deadly. Our story begins in a villa outside Rome, where Senator Marcus Flavius has decided to throw a feast that will be talked about for generations. He's imported peacock tongues from Gaul, dormice stuffed with honey and nuts, and wine that's been aged longer than most of his slaves have been alive. The guest list reads like a who's who of Roman society: senators, merchants, military commanders, and their wives, all eager to see and be seen. The evening starts magnificently. Guests recline on silk-covered couches, their hands washed with rose water between courses. The first course arrives, eggs prepared 7 different ways, each more elaborate than the last. There are quail eggs floating in a sauce made from fermented fish entrails, ostrich eggs carved into intricate patterns and filled with spiced meat, and tiny songbird eggs arranged like jewels on golden plates. But Marcus has a secret ingredient in tonight's menu, one that will turn this celebration into a catastrophe. You see, Marcus has been experimenting with a new delicacy he's heard whispers about in the markets. A rare mushroom that supposedly produces the most exquisite flavors and, according to some, mild euphoric effects. The mushroom dealers assured him it was perfectly safe when prepared correctly. They neglected to mention that correctly required knowledge they didn't possess. The mushrooms arrive as part of the third course, nestled in a sauce of wine and honey, garnished with herbs that mask their earthy, slightly bitter taste. They're beautiful, pale golden caps that seem to glow in the flickering lamplight. Marcus takes the first bite himself, savouring the complex flavours, the way they seem to dance on his tongue. Within minutes, the first guest begins to feel strange. Senator Gaius Antonius mentions that the room seems brighter, the conversations more vivid. Others nod in agreement. The wine must be particularly potent tonight. But then the hallucinations begin. Lady Claudia starts speaking to people who aren't there, carrying on animated conversations with empty air. A military commander begins seeing enemy soldiers emerging from the shadows, reaching for his sword that isn't there. The symptoms spread like wildfire through the dining room as more guests succumb to the poisonous fungi. What Marcus didn't know, what the dealers failed to mention, was that these weren't just any mushrooms. They were Amanita phalloides, death caps, one of nature's most efficient killers. The initial euphoric effects were just the beginning. The real horror was yet to come. As the evening progresses, the symptoms worsen. Guests begin vomiting violently, their bodies rejecting the beautiful meal they'd been enjoying moments before. Some collapse, their nervous systems overwhelmed by the toxins coursing through their bloodstream. Others experience seizures, their limbs jerking uncontrollably as their brains struggle to function. Marcus watches in horror as his carefully planned evening dissolves into chaos. Slaves rush to help the afflicted guests, but there's nothing they can do. Roman medicine, advanced as it was for its time, had no antidote for mushroom poisoning. The guests who consumed the largest portions, those who complimented Marcus most enthusiastically on his exotic delicacy, are the first to die. By dawn, 7 guests are dead, including 2 senators and the wife of a prominent merchant. Another dozen are gravely ill, their survival uncertain. Marcus himself, having eaten only a small portion while busy hosting, survives but faces social and legal ruin. The scandal rocks Roman society. How could such a prestigious gathering turn so deadly? The aftermath is swift and brutal. Marcus loses his fortune in lawsuits, his reputation destroyed by association with the disaster. The mushroom dealers disappear into the night, their identities as mysterious as their deadly wares. The surviving guests carry physical and psychological scars for the rest of their lives, some never able to enjoy a meal without fear. This wasn't just a case of bad luck or poor judgment. It was a perfect storm of Roman excess, inadequate food safety knowledge, and the dangerous pursuit of culinary novelty. In a society that prized exotic foods and dramatic presentations above all else, the line between impressive and lethal was thinner than anyone realized. The Roman appetite for dangerous dining didn't end with Marcus's disaster. If anything, it seemed to encourage even more reckless culinary experimentation. Wealthy Romans continued to seek out rare and potentially hazardous ingredients, viewing the risk as part of the thrill. Some hosted danger dinners, where guests knowingly consumed questionable delicacies, treating potential poisoning as an exciting gamble. But Marcus's feast became a cautionary tale whispered in Roman dining rooms for generations. It reminded everyone that in the pursuit of the perfect meal, the difference between a memorable evening and a fatal one could be as small as a single bite of the wrong mushroom. The irony wasn't lost on contemporary observers. In a civilization that had conquered most of the known world, that had built roads and aqueducts that would last millennia, that had created legal and governmental systems still studied today, a simple fungus could bring down senators and merchants with equal efficiency. As we'll see throughout our journey tonight, this pattern repeats throughout history. The most dangerous meals often come not from obvious threats like spoiled meat or contaminated water, but from humanity's endless desire to push culinary boundaries, to taste the untasted, to transform dining from mere sustenance into an adventure, and sometimes adventures have casualties. Chapter 2. The Deadly Delicacy of Feudal Japan. Let's travel forward in time and across the world to feudal Japan, where the pursuit of culinary perfection took on an almost spiritual significance. In a culture that elevated the preparation and presentation of food to an art form, where every meal was a meditation on beauty, seasonality, and harmony, you might expect dining to be a safe and serene experience. You would be catastrophically wrong. Our story takes place in 1603, during the early days of the Tokugawa shogunate, in the kitchen of Lord Matsudaira Yoshinao, a daimyo known throughout the region for his exquisite taste and his willingness to pay astronomical sums for rare ingredients. His chef, a master named Takeshi, had spent decades perfecting his craft, studying under the greatest culinary artists of his time. Takeshi prided himself on his ability to prepare fugu, the notorious pufferfish that contains enough tetrodotoxin to kill 30 adult humans. In the hands of a master, fugu becomes a transcendent dining experience, the fish's delicate flavour enhanced by the diner's awareness of the danger involved. The slight tingling sensation on the lips and tongue caused by trace amounts of the toxin was considered the mark of perfect preparation. But on this particular autumn evening, perfection would prove elusive. Lord Matsudaira had invited his most important allies for a crucial political dinner. The Tokugawa regime was still consolidating power, and alliances formed over shared meals could determine the fate of entire provinces. The menu had been planned for weeks, each dish carefully selected to demonstrate both wealth and sophistication. The evening centerpiece was to be fugu prepared 3 ways, as sashimi in a delicate broth and grilled with a subtle miso glaze. Takeshi had personally selected the fish that morning from his most trusted supplier, examining each specimen with the practiced eye of someone who understood that a single mistake could be fatal. The preparation of fugu requires not just skill, but an almost supernatural level of concentration. The fish's liver, ovaries and skin contain the highest concentrations of tetrodotoxin, and these must be removed with surgical precision. A single nick of the knife in the wrong place, a moment's inattention, and the supposedly safe flesh becomes a death sentence. Takeshi had performed this ritual thousands of times, his hands moving with the fluid grace of a master calligrapher. But tonight, something was different. Perhaps it was the pressure of the political importance of the dinner, or maybe the fish itself was unusual. Some specimens contain higher toxin levels than others, and even experts can't always predict which ones. The first course arrives at the low tables where the guests kneel in formal Caesar position. The fugu sashimi is presented like a work of art, translucent slices arranged in a pattern that mimics chrysanthemum petals, garnished with delicate vegetables and a ponzu dipping sauce. The guests admire the presentation before taking their first bites. The conversation flows as smoothly as the sake, the men discussing politics, poetry, and the changing seasons with the refined discourse expected of their class. The slight tingling sensation from the fugu is noted and appreciated, a sign that Takeshi has achieved the perfect balance between safety and excitement. But as the evening progresses, the tingling becomes more pronounced. What should have been a subtle sensation begins to spread from lips and tongue to face and extremities. The guests initially mistake this for the effect of the sake, or perhaps the excitement of the political discussions. Lord Matsudaira is the first to realize something is wrong. A veteran of many fugu dinners, he recognizes that the numbness in his hands is far beyond what he's ever experienced. He tries to speak to alert his guests, but finds his voice slurring, his tongue thick and unresponsive. The symptoms escalate rapidly. Tetrodotoxin is a neurotoxin that blocks sodium channels in nerve cells, effectively shutting down the nervous system while leaving the victim fully conscious. It's a particularly cruel poison. The mind remains clear even as the body becomes completely paralyzed. One by one, the guests find themselves unable to move, unable to speak, barely able to breathe. Their hearts continue to beat, their minds remain alert, but their bodies have become prisons. They can only lie there, fully aware of what's happening to them as their respiratory systems slowly shut down. Takeshi, who had tasted the fish during preparation as was his custom, is among the first to succumb. He collapses in the kitchen, his assistant finding him motionless, but with his eyes still moving, still aware. The assistant, realizing the magnitude of the disaster, rushes to summon physicians, but in 1603 Japan, there is no treatment for tetrodotoxin poisoning. The scene in the dining room is one of silent horror. 7 of Japan's most powerful men lie paralyzed, their formal kimonos now seeming like funeral shrouds. Their wives and retainers can only watch helplessly as the poison completes its work. Some of the men survive for hours, their eyes tracking movement, their minds trapped in bodies that no longer obey their commands. By morning, 5 of the 7 guests are dead, including Lord Matsudaira himself. The 2 survivors suffer permanent neurological damage, their political careers effectively ended. Takeshi dies before dawn, his reputation as a master chef transformed overnight into infamy. The political ramifications are immediate and severe. The deaths of so many important allies weakens the Tokugawa position in the region, forcing a reorganization of power that takes years to stabilize. What was meant to be a dinner to strengthen political bonds instead creates a power vacuum that rival factions are quick to exploit. But the cultural impact is perhaps even more significant. The disaster leads to some of the first formal regulations regarding fugu preparation, though these won't be fully codified for centuries. More immediately, it reinforces the Japanese cultural association between food and death, the idea that the most exquisite pleasures often come with the highest risks. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on contemporary observers. In a culture that prized precision, discipline, and mastery above all else, where the preparation of food was considered a spiritual practice, a single moment of imperfection had catastrophic consequences. The very qualities that made Japanese cuisine so refined, the pursuit of perfection, the willingness to take risks for the sake of art, the belief that danger could enhance pleasure, had created the conditions for disaster. Takeshi's story became a cautionary tale told in kitchens throughout Japan, a reminder that even masters could fall victim to overconfidence. But it didn't stop the consumption of fugu. If anything, it enhanced the fish's reputation as the ultimate test of culinary skill and courage. The survivors of that dinner, in their few remaining years, would never eat fugu again. But they also never forgot the transcendent flavour of those first few bites, the way the fish seemed to capture the essence of the sea itself. Even knowing how the evening ended, some admitted in private that they understood why people continued to risk their lives for such an experience. This duality, the simultaneous attraction and revulsion, the understanding that the greatest pleasures often come with the greatest risks, would define humanity's relationship with dangerous foods throughout history. As we'll see in our next chapter, the pursuit of culinary thrills would continue to claim victims across cultures and centuries, each disaster teaching lessons that the next generation would inevitably forget in their own quest for the perfect, dangerous meal. Chapter 3. The Poisoned Feast of the Borgias. Now we venture into Renaissance Italy, where dining had evolved into an elaborate form of political theatre, and where the line between guest and victim was often determined by the contents of one's wine glass. This is the world of the Borgias, where every meal was a potential battlefield, and every invitation could be your last. The year is 1503, and we find ourselves in the opulent dining hall of Cardinal Giovanni Battista Ferrari, a man whose wealth was matched only by his ambition and his talent for making enemies. Tonight's dinner party isn't just a social gathering, it's a carefully orchestrated political maneuver designed to secure alliances, eliminate rivals, and advance the Cardinal's position in the complex web of Vatican politics. The guest list reads like a catalogue of Renaissance power brokers, wealthy merchants whose loans keep kingdoms afloat, military commanders whose loyalty can shift the balance of wars, and fellow clergy whose influence extends far beyond the spiritual realm. Each guest has been carefully selected, not just for their political value, but for their potential threat to the Cardinal's ambitions. The dining hall itself is a masterpiece of Renaissance excess. Frescoed ceilings depict scenes of abundance and prosperity, while golden candelabras cast dancing shadows across walls hung with priceless tapestries. The tables groan under the weight of elaborate centerpieces, mechanical peacocks that spread their tails, fountains that flow with wine instead of water, and sculptures carved from sugar that seem almost too beautiful to eat. But beauty, as we'll discover, can be the perfect mask for horror. Cardinal Ferrari has enlisted the services of Maestro Lorenzo, a chef whose reputation for creating spectacular feasts is matched only by his discretion regarding his patrons' more unusual requests. Lorenzo has spent weeks planning this menu, sourcing ingredients from across Europe and beyond, Spanish saffron, French truffles, spices from the Orient that cost more than most people earn in a lifetime. The evening begins with a procession of servants carrying silver platters laden with delicacies that seem to defy both nature and reason. There are swans stuffed with smaller birds, which are themselves stuffed with even smaller birds, creating a culinary Russian doll of poultry. Peacocks are presented with their plumage intact, as if they had simply laid down to rest on beds of exotic fruits. Fish are arranged to appear as if they're swimming through gardens of crystallized flowers. The guests marvel at each presentation. Their conversations a careful dance of compliments and veiled threats, of political maneuvering disguised as casual chat. Wine flows freely, not just any wine, but vintages that have been aging since before some of the guests were born. The Cardinal is the perfect host, ensuring every glass is filled, every plate is full, every guest feels honoured by his attention. But Cardinal Ferrari has a secret agenda tonight, one that goes far beyond political alliance building. Among his guests are three men who pose particular threats to his ambitions. Duke Alessandro Medici, whose banking connections could strangle the Cardinal's financial plans. Commander Vittorio Orsini, whose military loyalty the Cardinal desperately needs but cannot secure through conventional means. And Bishop Paolo Colonna, whose influence with the Pope could make or break the Cardinal's ecclesiastical career. What the guests don't know is that their host has made arrangements with a specialist in what Renaissance Italians euphemistically called inheritance powder, a master poisoner whose services were available to those with sufficient wealth and flexible morals. The plan is elegant in its simplicity. Eliminate his three primary rivals while maintaining plausible deniability, making their deaths appear to be the result of sudden illness rather than deliberate murder. The poison of choice is a sophisticated blend based on arsenic, but refined and modified to delay its effects and mask its symptoms. Mixed into a special wine that will be served only to the targeted guests, it's designed to take effect hours after the dinner ends, when the victims are safely in their own homes and the Cardinal has dozens of witnesses to his own innocence. The fatal wine is served during the seventh course, presented in goblets of Venetian glass so fine they seem to capture and hold the candlelight. The Cardinal makes a toast to friendship, to mutual prosperity, to the bonds that unite them all in common cause. The three targeted guests drink deeply, honoured by their host's attention and the quality of the vintage. But here's where the Cardinal's plan encounters an unexpected complication, one that transforms a calculated assassination into a chaotic massacre. Maestro Lorenzo, unaware of his patron's murderous intentions, has been experimenting with a new technique for preserving and enhancing the flavour of wine. He's been adding small amounts of lead acetate, known as sugar of lead for its sweet taste, to certain vintages to improve their flavour and clarity. It's a practice that's becoming increasingly common among ambitious chefs, despite whispered warnings about its potential dangers. The combination of the Cardinal's arsenic-based poison and Lorenzo's lead additives creates a chemical cocktail far more deadly than either substance alone. The lead accelerates the absorption of the arsenic, while the arsenic enhances the toxicity of the lead, creating a synergistic effect that amplifies the lethality of both poisons. But the disaster doesn't stop there. In the confusion of serving multiple courses to dozens of guests, with servants rushing between kitchen and dining hall, the poisoned wine isn't limited to its intended targets. Cross-contamination occurs. Goblets are mixed up, wine is poured from the wrong decanters, and what was meant to be a surgical strike becomes a random slaughter. The first symptoms appear during the dessert course. Duke Alessandro begins to feel nauseous, attributing it initially to the richness of the meal. But within minutes, his condition deteriorates rapidly. Violent stomach cramps double him over, and he begins vomiting blood onto the pristine white tablecloth. The sight of blood transforms the elegant dinner party into a scene of panic. Other guests begin experiencing similar symptoms, some immediately, others more gradually, as the poison works its way through their systems. The dining hall fills with the sounds of retching, moaning, and increasingly desperate calls for physicians. Cardinal Ferrari watches in horror as his carefully planned assassination spirals into uncontrolled chaos. Not only are his intended targets dying, but so are valuable allies, potential supporters, and even some of his own household staff who had sampled the wine during preparation. What was meant to eliminate 3 rivals threatens to decimate an entire generation of Italian political leadership. The physicians who arrive can do little more than observe the carnage. Renaissance medicine, for all its advances, has no effective treatments for heavy metal poisoning. They try bloodletting, purging, and various herbal remedies, but these interventions often make the situation worse, accelerating the absorption of the toxins or further weakening already compromised systems. By dawn, 11 guests are dead, including all 3 of the Cardinal's intended targets, but also 8 others whose deaths serve no political purpose and create dangerous new enemies. Another 7 guests survive, but with permanent damage to their nervous systems, digestive organs, and cognitive functions. The Cardinal himself, who had been careful to avoid the contaminated wine, finds himself the prime suspect in what quickly becomes known as the Feast of Death. The political ramifications are immediate and catastrophic. The deaths of so many influential figures create a power vacuum that destabilizes the entire region. Families of the victims demand justice, launching investigations that threaten to expose not just the Cardinal's plot, but the entire network of political poisoning that had become commonplace in Renaissance Italy. Cardinal Ferrari's downfall is swift and absolute. Within weeks, he's arrested on charges of mass murder. His trial becomes a sensation, revealing the extent to which poison had become a tool of political advancement among the Italian elite. Under torture, a standard part of Renaissance judicial procedure, He confesses not only to this crime, but to several previous poisonings that had been attributed to natural causes. The cardinal is executed publicly, his death serving as both punishment and warning. But his execution doesn't end the practice of political poisoning. If anything, it drives it further underground, making future practitioners more careful, more subtle, and ultimately more dangerous. Maestro Lorenzo, the unwitting accomplice whose lead additives had amplified the disaster, flees Italy entirely, his reputation destroyed and his life in danger from the families of the victims. He dies in exile in France, never knowing that his culinary innovation had transformed a targeted assassination into a mass casualty event. The Feast of Death becomes a cautionary tale that spreads throughout European courts, a reminder that in the world of Renaissance politics, every meal could be your last. But rather than deterring the practice of poisoning, it simply encourages more sophisticated methods, better planning, and more careful execution. The irony of the situation, that a dinner meant to eliminate political rivals instead created new ones, that a plan designed to advance the cardinal's career instead ended it, that culinary innovation intended to enhance pleasure instead delivered death, wasn't lost on contemporary observers. It became a perfect example of how the pursuit of power, combined with the pleasures of the table, could create conditions for disaster that no amount of planning could fully control. As we'll see in our next chapter, the lessons of the Borgia's era, that food could be a weapon, that hospitality could mask hostility, that the most dangerous meals often came from the most trusted sources, would echo through history, finding new expressions in different cultures and different centuries, but always carrying the same fundamental truth. When dining becomes a tool of power, everyone at the table becomes a potential victim. Chapter 4. The Ergot Epidemic of Salem. We now journey to colonial Massachusetts in 1692, where a seemingly innocent grain would spark one of history's most infamous episodes of mass hysteria. This isn't just a story about dangerous food, it's about how a contaminated meal can reshape an entire society's understanding of reality itself. The winter of 1691 had been particularly harsh in Salem village, and the spring planting season brought both hope and hidden danger. The rye crop, a staple grain that formed the backbone of colonial New England's diet, grew abundantly in the damp conditions that followed the brutal winter. But lurking within those golden stalks was a fungus that would transform bread from sustenance into a catalyst for madness. Ergot, a parasitic fungus that grows on rye and other grains, contains compounds closely related to LSD. When consumed regularly in small doses, as would happen when eating bread made from contaminated grain, it can cause a condition known as ergotism, characterized by hallucinations, convulsions, and a burning sensation in the extremities that medieval Europeans called St. Anthony's fire. But the people of Salem village knew nothing of fungal contamination or psychoactive compounds. When strange symptoms began appearing in their community, they had only one framework for understanding such inexplicable events: witchcraft. The story begins in the household of Reverend Samuel Parris, where his 9-year-old daughter Betty and 11-year-old niece Abigail Williams start exhibiting bizarre behavior after their daily meals of rye bread and porridge. They complain of feeling as though insects are crawling under their skin. They see visions of dark figures lurking in corners, and they experience violent fits that leave them writhing on the floor. The symptoms spread to other young women in the village who share meals at the Parris household or consume bread from the same contaminated grain supplies. Ann Putnam Jr., Mercy Lewis, Mary Walcott, and others begin experiencing similar episodes, hallucinations, convulsions, and the terrifying sensation that their bodies are being controlled by external forces. Dr. William Griggs, the village physician, examines the afflicted girls but can find no medical explanation for their condition. In a community where supernatural explanations are more readily accepted than natural ones, where the devil is believed to be constantly seeking new souls to corrupt, the diagnosis seems obvious: witchcraft. What the good doctor doesn't realize is that he's witnessing a textbook case of ergot poisoning. The contaminated rye, ground into flour and baked into the daily bread that forms the cornerstone of every meal, is slowly poisoning the entire community. But the effects aren't uniform. Some people are more sensitive to the alkaloids than others. Some consume more contaminated bread, and some have metabolisms that process the toxins differently. The result is a pattern of symptoms that seems to follow no logical medical progression, appearing to strike randomly and affecting victims in ways that defy contemporary understanding of disease. To a community already primed to believe in supernatural intervention, these seemingly inexplicable afflictions can only be the work of witches. The accusations begin with the most vulnerable members of society: Sarah Good, a homeless beggar; Sarah Osborne, an elderly woman who rarely attends church; and Tituba, a Caribbean slave in the Paris household. These women, already marginalized by their social status, become convenient scapegoats for the community's growing terror. But as more people consume the contaminated grain, the symptoms spread beyond the initial group of young accusers. Adults begin experiencing their own episodes of hallucinations and physical distress. However, rather than recognizing a pattern that might suggest a common cause like food contamination, the community interprets each new case as evidence of an expanding conspiracy of witches. The contaminated grain supply affects different households in different ways, creating a seemingly random pattern of affliction that reinforces supernatural explanations. Families who purchase their grain from certain mills experience more severe symptoms, while those who grow their own rye or buy from different sources remain largely unaffected. But without understanding the connection between food source and symptoms, these variations appear to confirm that witches are selectively targeting their victims. The legal proceedings that follow are a perfect storm of ergot-induced paranoia, social tensions, and judicial incompetence. The afflicted accusers, their perceptions distorted by chronic ergot consumption, genuinely believe they see spectral evidence of witchcraft. Their hallucinations are vivid and consistent enough to convince not only themselves, but also the judges and juries who hear their testimony. Martha Corey, a respected church member, finds herself accused when she questions the validity of the spectral evidence. Her skepticism, which might have helped expose the true cause of the community's afflictions, instead marks her as a threat to the prevailing narrative. She's arrested, tried, and eventually executed, her voice of reason silenced by a community in the grip of mass poisoning. The trials take on a momentum of their own, fueled by the ongoing consumption of contaminated grain. Each day brings new accusations, new arrests, and new testimonies from witnesses whose perceptions are compromised by the very food they eat for sustenance. The ergot alkaloids don't just cause hallucinations, they also increase suggestibility and paranoia, making the accusers more likely to believe their own distorted perceptions and more willing to implicate others. Bridget Bishop becomes the first person executed in the Salem witch trials, hanged on June 10th, 1692. Her death doesn't end the hysteria. Instead, it seems to validate the community's belief that they're under supernatural attack. More executions follow, Sarah Good, Sarah Wilds, Elizabeth Howe, Susanna Martin, and others, each death reinforcing the cycle of fear and accusation. The contaminated grain supply continues to fuel the crisis throughout the summer of 1692. The ergot alkaloids build up in the systems of regular consumers, creating chronic symptoms that wax and wane but never fully disappear. This pattern of recurring afflictions seems to confirm that the witches are continuing their supernatural attacks, requiring ever more drastic measures to combat them. But as autumn approaches, several factors begin to shift the dynamic. The new harvest brings fresh grain that hasn't been contaminated with ergot, gradually reducing the community's exposure to the psychoactive compounds. The symptoms that had seemed so mysterious and supernatural begin to fade as people's diets shift to the new uncontaminated grain. Simultaneously, the scope of the accusations begins to threaten people with real social and political power. When the wife of Governor William Phips is accused of witchcraft, the political establishment suddenly develops a more skeptical attitude toward spectral evidence. The realization that no one is safe from accusation forces a reconsideration of the entire proceedings. Reverend Increase Mather, one of the most influential religious leaders in Massachusetts, publishes Cases of Conscience Concerning Evil Spirits, which questions the reliability of spectral evidence and calls for higher standards of proof in witchcraft trials. His intervention provides intellectual cover for those who want to end the trials, but need a face-saving way to do so. The Salem witch trials officially end in May 1693, but not before 20 people have been executed and many more have died in prison awaiting trial. The community slowly begins to recognize that they may have made terrible mistakes, though they never identify the true cause of the crisis that started it all. The ergot connection to Salem wouldn't be proposed by historians until the 1970s, nearly 3 centuries after the events. But the evidence is compelling. The pattern of symptoms matches ergot poisoning. The timing coincides with weather conditions that favour ergot growth, and the geographical distribution of accusations correlates with areas that would have consumed grain from the most contaminated sources. The tragedy of Salem isn't just that innocent people died, it's that they died because of a contaminated food supply that no one understood well enough to identify. The very bread that was meant to sustain the community instead poisoned it, creating the conditions for a mass hysteria that destroyed lives, families, and the social fabric of an entire region. The irony is profound. A community that prided itself on its religious devotion and moral clarity was undone by its daily bread. The Puritans of Salem believed they were fighting a spiritual battle against supernatural evil, never realizing that their enemy was a fungus growing in their grain fields, transforming their most basic sustenance into a source of madness and death. The lessons of Salem extend far beyond the specific circumstances of 1692. They remind us that our perceptions of reality can be altered by what we eat, that mass hysteria can have biological as well as social causes, and that the most dangerous meals aren't always the ones that kill quickly. Sometimes they're the ones that slowly poison our ability to distinguish between truth and delusion, between genuine threats and imaginary enemies. Chapter 5. The Great Molasses Flood Feast. Let's shift our focus from individual poisonings to a disaster that combined industrial negligence with culinary catastrophe on an unprecedented scale. Our destination is Boston, Massachusetts, January 15th, 1919, where a routine industrial accident would create one of history's most bizarre and deadly food-related disasters. The North End of Boston in 1919 was a bustling immigrant neighborhood, home to Italian families who had brought their culinary traditions across the Atlantic. The narrow streets were lined with bakeries, restaurants, and small groceries that served the community's needs while maintaining connections to the old country. It was a place where food wasn't just sustenance, it was culture, identity, and comfort in a new land. Looming over this vibrant neighborhood was an industrial monstrosity that seemed completely out of place among the tenements and small businesses. A massive steel tank, 50 feet tall and 90 feet in diameter, containing 2.3 million gallons of crude molasses. The tank belonged to the United States Industrial Alcohol Company, which used the molasses to produce ethyl alcohol for both industrial purposes and, during Prohibition, for the production of rum. The tank had been hastily constructed during World War I to meet increased demand for industrial alcohol. Its design was flawed from the beginning. The steel was too thin, the rivets were inadequate, and the structure had never been properly tested for the stresses it would face when fully loaded. Local residents had complained about the tank leaking molasses for years, but their concerns were dismissed by company officials who saw the immigrant community as having little political power. What the residents didn't know was that the tank had been filled with a particularly volatile batch of molasses just days before. This wasn't the thick, slow-moving syrup you might drizzle on pancakes. It was a crude, industrial product that had been heated to reduce its viscosity for easier transport. The warm molasses, combined with the unusually warm January weather, created internal pressures that the poorly designed tank simply couldn't withstand. At approximately 12:30 p.m. on January 15th, as workers were taking their lunch breaks and children were walking home from school, the tank catastrophically failed. The failure wasn't gradual, it was instantaneous and complete. The entire structure burst apart, releasing its contents in a tsunami of molasses that would forever change how we think about industrial food safety. The wave of molasses that erupted from the failed tank was initially 25 feet high and moved at speeds of up to 35 miles per hour. This wasn't the slow-moving syrup of popular imagination. It was a fast-moving wall of death that swept away everything in its path. The sheer volume and speed of the molasses gave it the destructive power of a flash flood, but with a crucial difference. Unlike water, molasses doesn't drain away quickly. The first victims were the workers at a nearby construction site who were eating their lunch outdoors, enjoying the unusually warm January day. They saw the tank burst and the brown wave approaching, but there was no time to run. The molasses engulfed them instantly, its sticky consistency making escape impossible. Those who weren't killed immediately by the impact found themselves trapped in a substance that hardened around them as it cooled, creating a suffocating prison. The wave continued its destructive path through the North End, demolishing buildings, overturning vehicles, and trapping residents who had been going about their daily routines. The Clofferty house, where the family was preparing their midday meal, was completely destroyed, killing 2 family members instantly. The molasses poured through their kitchen windows and doors, mixing with their food preparations to create a grotesque parody of cooking. At the Purity Distilling Company's office building, workers were trapped on upper floors as molasses filled the lower levels. Some tried to escape by breaking windows and climbing down, but the molasses had coated everything with a slippery, sticky film that made movement nearly impossible. Several workers fell to their deaths when they lost their grip on molasses-covered surfaces. The disaster's impact on the neighborhood's food culture was immediate and devastating. bakeries that had been preparing bread for the day found their ovens flooded with molasses, creating toxic fumes as the sugar burned at high temperatures. Restaurants had their kitchens destroyed, their carefully prepared ingredients contaminated beyond salvage. Small groceries lost their entire inventories as molasses seeped into every container, every package, every piece of food. But the contamination went beyond simple property damage. The molasses that flooded the neighborhood wasn't food grade. It was an industrial product that contained impurities, chemicals, and contaminants that made it dangerous to consume. As it mixed with the neighborhood's food supplies, it created a toxic environment that would persist for months. The rescue efforts were hampered by the unique properties of molasses. Unlike water, which can be pumped away or allowed to drain, molasses clings to everything it touches. Rescuers found themselves moving through a landscape that seemed designed to trap and exhaust them. Every step was a struggle against the sticky substance that coated the ground. Every surface they touched threatened to hold them fast. The search for survivors became a nightmare of logistics and endurance. Rescuers had to work in shifts because the physical demands of moving through molasses-covered terrain were exhausting. They used shovels, picks, and even steam hoses to try to clear paths through the hardening molasses, but progress was agonizingly slow. Some of the most heartbreaking discoveries were made in the neighborhood's kitchens and dining rooms, where families had been caught in the middle of their daily meals. The D'Estacio family was found in their kitchen, where they had been preparing lunch when the wave hit. The molasses had mixed with their food, creating a scene that rescue workers described as surreal and horrifying, a family meal transformed into a death trap. The cleanup efforts revealed the full extent of the disaster's impact on the neighborhood's food systems. Every restaurant, bakery, and grocery store in the affected area had to be completely gutted and rebuilt. The molasses had penetrated into walls, floors, and foundations, creating a contamination problem that couldn't be simply washed away. Local health officials faced an unprecedented challenge in determining what food supplies could be salvaged and what had to be destroyed. The molasses contamination wasn't just a matter of stickiness. The industrial-grade molasses contained chemicals and impurities that made any contaminated food potentially dangerous to consume. Entire warehouses of food had to be condemned and destroyed. The disaster also revealed the vulnerability of urban food systems to industrial accidents. The North End's residents had been living next to a massive industrial facility without understanding the risks it posed to their daily lives. The tank's failure didn't just kill 21 people and injure 150 others. It destroyed the food security of an entire neighborhood. In the aftermath of the flood, many families found themselves not only homeless, but also without access to familiar foods. The Italian bakeries and restaurants that had maintained their cultural connections were gone, replaced by a landscape of destruction and contamination. Some families left the neighborhood entirely, unable to rebuild their lives in a place that now carried such traumatic associations. The legal battles that followed the disaster established important precedents for industrial liability and food safety. The United States Industrial Alcohol Company was found liable for the disaster, with the court ruling that the company had been negligent in the tank's design, construction, and maintenance. The case helped establish the principle that companies have a responsibility to ensure their industrial operations don't threaten public safety, including food safety. The Great Molasses Flood also led to significant changes in building codes and industrial regulations. The disaster demonstrated that industrial facilities located near residential areas needed much stricter oversight and safety standards. New regulations required better engineering, more thorough testing, and regular inspections of industrial structures that could threaten public safety. But perhaps the most lasting impact of the disaster was on how communities think about the relationship between industrial food production and residential areas. The North End residents had lived for years with a massive tank of industrial molasses in their neighbourhood, never fully understanding the risks it posed to their daily lives and food security. The irony of the Great Molasses Flood is that it involved a substance that, in its refined form, brings sweetness and pleasure to millions of meals, but in its industrial form, concentrated in massive quantities and stored without adequate safety measures, that same substance became an agent of destruction and death. The disaster serves as a reminder that even the most benign food ingredients can become dangerous when industrial processes prioritize efficiency and profit over safety and community welfare. The neighborhood eventually rebuilt, but it was never quite the same. The disaster had destroyed not just buildings and businesses, but also the sense of security that comes from knowing your daily environment is safe. For the survivors and their descendants, the smell of molasses would forever carry associations not of sweetness and comfort, but of terror and loss. Chapter 6: The Tainted Tuna of Minamata. Our journey now takes us to post-war Japan, to a small fishing village where the ocean's bounty would become a source of unimaginable suffering. This is the story of Minamata, where industrial pollution transformed the sea's gifts into instruments of slow, agonizing death, and where an entire community would pay the price for corporate negligence with their health, their livelihoods, and their lives. Minamata Bay in the 1950s was a picture of traditional Japanese coastal life. Fishing families had worked these waters for generations, their lives intimately connected to the rhythms of the sea. The bay provided not just their livelihood, but their primary source of protein, fish, shellfish, and seaweed that formed the foundation of their daily meals. The Chiso Corporation's chemical plant, which had operated on the bay since 1908, was initially seen as a source of prosperity for the region. The plant provided jobs and brought modern industry to what had been a primarily agricultural and fishing economy. For decades, the relationship between the plant and the community seemed mutually beneficial. The factory provided employment and economic growth, while the bay continued to provide its traditional bounty. But beneath the surface of this apparent harmony, a deadly transformation was taking place. The Chiso plant was dumping wastewater containing mercury compounds directly into Minamata Bay, where the mercury was being converted by bacteria into methylmercury, one of the most toxic substances known to science. This methylmercury was then being absorbed by the bay's marine life, concentrating as it moved up the food chain. The first signs of trouble appeared in the early 1950s, but they were subtle and easily dismissed. Cats in the fishing village began exhibiting strange behavior. They would dance erratically, foam at the mouth, and sometimes throw themselves into the bay as if trying to escape some invisible torment. The locals called it dancing cat disease, treating it as a curiosity rather than a warning. The cats were the canaries in the coal mine, their smaller bodies and higher metabolisms making them more sensitive to the mercury poisoning that was slowly building up in the bay's ecosystem. But the human residents, who consumed fish and shellfish as their primary protein source, were also being exposed to increasing levels of methylmercury with every meal. The Hamamoto family exemplified the tragedy that was unfolding throughout the village. Tsurumatsu Hamamoto was a fisherman who had worked the bay his entire life, as had his father and grandfather before him. His wife Shizuko prepared their daily meals from the fish he caught, following recipes and techniques passed down through generations of fishing families. Their diet was simple but rich in the bay's produce: grilled fish for breakfast, fish soup for lunch, and sashimi, or simmered fish, for dinner. Shellfish, seaweed, and small fish were constant elements of their meals, providing not just nutrition but cultural continuity with their ancestors. They took pride in their ability to identify the best fish, to prepare them in ways that honored both the catch and the tradition. But with every meal, the Hamamoto family was consuming methyl mercury that had accumulated in the tissues of their food. The poison was odorless, tasteless, and invisible. There was no way for them to detect its presence or understand the danger they faced. The fish looked healthy, tasted normal, and provided the same nutritional benefits they always had. The contamination was completely undetectable to the senses. The first human symptoms appeared in 1956, when several residents of the fishing village began experiencing neurological problems that doctors couldn't explain. The symptoms were bizarre and terrifying: numbness in hands and feet, difficulty speaking and swallowing, tunnel vision, and loss of coordination. Some patients experienced violent convulsions, while others fell into comas from which they never recovered. Dr. Hajime Hosokawa, the physician at the Chiso Company Hospital, was among the first to recognize that these weren't isolated cases, but part of a larger pattern. He began documenting the symptoms and looking for common factors among the affected patients. What he found was disturbing. All of the victims were from fishing families who consumed large amounts of seafood from Minamata Bay. The Hamamoto family was among the early victims. Tsurumatsu began experiencing difficulty with his balance and coordination, making it dangerous for him to work on his fishing boat. Shizuko developed severe numbness in her extremities and began having trouble preparing meals, her hands no longer able to handle knives and cooking implements with their former skill. But the most heartbreaking cases were the children. Babies born to mothers who had consumed contaminated fish during pregnancy were born with severe neurological damage. These children, who would later be known as Minamata disease babies, suffered from cerebral palsy-like symptoms, severe intellectual disabilities, and physical deformities that would affect them for their entire lives. The Hamamoto's youngest daughter, born in 1955, was one of these victims. She never learned to walk or speak, her nervous system so damaged by prenatal mercury exposure that she required constant care. The fish that had nourished generations of the family had poisoned her before she was even born, stealing her future and breaking her parents' hearts. As more cases appeared, the connection to seafood consumption became undeniable. But the Chiso Corporation and local government officials were reluctant to acknowledge the link, fearing the economic consequences of admitting that the bay's fish were poisoned. They commissioned studies that seemed designed more to obscure the truth than reveal it, while continuing to allow mercury-contaminated wastewater to flow into the bay. Dr. Hosokawa, working with limited resources and facing pressure from his employer, conducted his own research into the cause of the mysterious disease. He fed cats laboratory food mixed with fish and shellfish from Minamata Bay, and the results were conclusive. The cats developed the same neurological symptoms as the human victims. The bay's seafood was definitely the source of the poisoning. But when Dr. Hosokawa attempted to publish his findings, he was blocked by Chiso Corporation executives who feared the legal and financial consequences of admitting responsibility. His research was suppressed, his access to patients was restricted, and he was eventually forced to abandon his investigation. The truth about Minamata disease would remain hidden for years while more victims suffered and died. The fishing families found themselves in an impossible situation. The sea that had sustained them for generations was now poisoning them, but they had no other source of livelihood or protein. Some families tried to switch to other foods, but fish and shellfish were not just their primary nutrition source. They were also their primary source of income. Stopping fishing meant both starvation and economic ruin. The contamination also destroyed the social fabric of the fishing community. Families who had worked together for generations found themselves divided by suspicion and fear. Some blamed the chemical plant, others blamed bad luck or divine punishment. The uncertainty about the cause of the disease created tensions that fractured relationships and destroyed the cooperative spirit that had sustained the community for centuries. The Hamamoto family, like many others, faced a terrible choice: continue eating the fish that might be killing them, or abandon their traditional way of life entirely. They tried to reduce their fish consumption, but alternatives were expensive and unfamiliar. The vegetables and rice that could replace fish in their diet cost money they didn't have, especially as Tsurumatsu's illness made it increasingly difficult for him to work. The tragedy deepened as the full extent of the contamination became clear. The methyl mercury hadn't just affected the fish, it had contaminated the entire marine ecosystem. Shellfish, seaweed, and even the sediment at the bottom of the bay contained dangerous levels of mercury. Every aspect of the traditional fishing lifestyle had become a potential source of poisoning. By the early 1960s, hundreds of people in the Minamata area had been diagnosed with mercury poisoning, and many more were showing early symptoms. The disease had a particularly cruel progression. Victims often remained conscious and aware even as their nervous systems deteriorated, watching helplessly as they lost the ability to speak, walk, or care for themselves. The Chiso Corporation finally stopped dumping mercury-containing wastewater into the bay in 1968, but the damage was already done. The mercury that had accumulated in the bay's sediments would continue to contaminate the marine life for decades. Even today, more than 50 years later, some areas of Minamata Bay remain too contaminated for safe fishing. The legal battles that followed established important precedents for corporate responsibility and environmental protection. The victims and their families fought for decades to receive compensation and recognition from Chiso Corporation and the Japanese government. Their struggle helped establish the principle that corporations can be held liable for environmental damage that affects public health. But for the fishing families of Minamata, no amount of compensation could restore what they had lost. The Hamamoto family, like many others, saw their traditional way of life destroyed by contamination that could have been prevented. Tsurumatsu died in 1972, his body finally succumbing to the mercury that had accumulated in his tissues over years of consuming contaminated fish. Shizuko lived longer but never recovered her health, spending her final years caring for their disabled daughter. The tragedy of Minamata serves as a powerful reminder that our food systems are vulnerable to industrial contamination, and that the effects of such contamination can persist for generations. The fishing families who trusted in the ocean's bounty had no way of knowing that their daily meals were slowly poisoning them, no way of detecting the invisible contamination that was destroying their health and their community. The irony of Minamata is profound. The sea that had sustained the community for centuries became the agent of its destruction, not through any natural disaster or change in the marine ecosystem, but through human greed and negligence. The fish that represented life, tradition, and cultural identity became symbols of death and corporate betrayal. The lessons of Minamata extend far beyond the specific circumstances of mercury contamination in a Japanese fishing village. They remind us that industrial activities can have far-reaching consequences for food safety, that the effects of contamination can be delayed and subtle, and that the most vulnerable members of society, children, the elderly, and those dependent on local food sources, often bear the greatest burden when our food systems fail. Today, Minamata Bay has largely recovered from its contamination, and fishing has resumed in many areas. But the scars remain, in the survivors who still suffer from mercury poisoning, in the families who lost loved ones to a preventable disaster, and in the collective memory of a community that learned too late that the price of industrial progress can be measured in human suffering. Chapter 7. The Radioactive Radium Dinner Party. Our penultimate tale takes us to the glittering world of 1920s high society, where scientific ignorance combined with fashionable excess to create one of history's most literally glowing examples of dangerous dining. This is the story of a dinner party where the guests didn't just consume poison, they consumed radioactive material that would kill them slowly, painfully, and with a luminescent glow that seemed almost magical until it became deadly. The setting is New York City, 1925, in the opulent penthouse apartment of industrialist Harrison Blackwood, a man whose fortune was built on the booming radium industry. Radium, discovered by Marie and Pierre Curie just decades earlier, was being hailed as a miracle substance with seemingly endless applications. It was used in everything from watch dials to medical treatments, and its mysterious glow made it a symbol of modernity and scientific progress. What the public didn't understand, what even many scientists didn't fully grasp, was that radium was one of the most dangerous substances on Earth, a radioactive element that could cause cancer, anemia, and a host of other fatal conditions. The very properties that made it seem magical, its ability to glow in the dark, its apparent energy, were signs of its deadly radioactive decay. Blackwood had made his fortune manufacturing radium-based products, from luminous paint for watch faces to radium water that was marketed as a health tonic. He was a true believer in radium's beneficial properties, consuming radium water daily and encouraging others to do the same. His dinner parties had become famous not just for their luxury, but for their incorporation of radium-based novelties that amazed and delighted his guests. Tonight's party was to be his masterpiece, a celebration of both his business success and his faith in radium's miraculous properties. He had commissioned a special menu that incorporated radium in ways that would dazzle his guests while demonstrating his commitment to the substance that had made him rich. The guest list was a who's who of New York society: wealthy industrialists, prominent socialites, influential politicians, and celebrated artists. Among them was Dr. Frederick Morrison, a physician who had been experimenting with radium treatments for various ailments. Margaret Ashford, a socialite known for her adventurous spirit and willingness to try the latest fashions and fads. And Senator William Crawford, a powerful politician whose support Blackwood needed for his expanding business ventures. The evening began with cocktails served in glasses that had been treated with radium-based luminous paint, causing them to glow with an eerie green light in the dimmed penthouse. The guests were enchanted by the spectacle, raising their glowing glasses in toasts while marvelling at the scientific wonder they were witnessing. The drinks themselves contained radium water, marketed as liquid sunshine for its supposed health benefits. The first course was equally spectacular. Oysters that had been soaked in radium-enhanced brine, causing them to emit a faint luminescence that made them appear like jewels on the half shell. The guests consumed them eagerly, delighting in the novelty of eating food that seemed to generate its own light. The conversation buzzed with excitement about the wonders of modern science and the bright future that radium promised. But the evening's centerpiece was yet to come. Blackwood had commissioned a special dessert from the city's most exclusive confectioner, an elaborate cake decorated with radium-based frosting that glowed like captured starlight. The cake was wheeled into the darkened dining room on a silver cart, its luminous decorations creating patterns of light that seemed to dance across the walls. The guests applauded as Blackwood cut the first slice, the radium-enhanced frosting leaving glowing traces on the knife blade. Each guest received a portion of the glowing dessert, and they consumed it with the enthusiasm of people participating in what they believed was a harmless, scientific demonstration. Dr. Morrison, who should have known better given his medical training, was particularly enthusiastic about the radium-enhanced menu. He had been treating patients with radium-based therapies and genuinely believed in its curative properties. He consumed larger portions than most guests, viewing the evening as both entertainment and a form of preventive medicine. Margaret Ashford, always eager to be at the forefront of the latest trends, made a point of consuming every radium-enhanced item on the menu. She joked with other guests about how the radium would give her a healthy glow, not realizing how literally and tragically prophetic her words would prove to be. Senator Crawford, more cautious by nature but not wanting to offend his host, consumed moderate amounts of the radium-enhanced foods and drinks. He was particularly impressed by the glowing cocktails, which he described as the most remarkable thing I've ever seen, in a letter to his wife the following day. The party was deemed a tremendous success by all who attended. The guests left that evening convinced they had witnessed the future of dining, a glimpse of how science would transform even the most basic human activities. The glowing foods and drinks had been not just novel but delicious, prepared by skilled chefs who had managed to incorporate the radium enhancements without compromising flavor or presentation. But within weeks, the first symptoms began to appear. Dr. Morrison was among the first to notice problems: fatigue, unexplained bruising, and a persistent metallic taste in his mouth that he initially attributed to stress from his medical practice. When his condition worsened, he consulted colleagues who were baffled by his symptoms. Margaret Ashford began experiencing severe anemia, her vibrant energy replaced by constant exhaustion and weakness. Her skin took on a pale, almost translucent quality that her friends initially complimented as fashionably ethereal. But as her condition deteriorated, the compliments turned to concerned whispers about her health. Senator Crawford developed what appeared to be a severe case of arthritis, his joints becoming swollen and painful. He attributed it to the stress of his political career and the dampness of Washington's climate, never connecting his symptoms to that glowing dinner party months earlier. Blackwood himself, who had been consuming radium products for years, began showing signs of what would later be recognized as radiation sickness. His teeth became loose and began falling out, his jaw developed painful sores that wouldn't heal, and his bones became so brittle that minor falls resulted in serious fractures. The tragic irony was that the very substance these people had consumed with such enthusiasm was slowly destroying their bodies from the inside. Radium, when ingested, is absorbed by the bones where it continues to emit radiation for years, causing cancer, anemia, and a condition that came to be known as radium jaw, a painful deterioration of the jawbone that was particularly common among workers in radium-based industries. As the months passed, the connection between the dinner party and the guests' declining health became impossible to ignore. Dr. Morrison, despite his own illness, was among the first to recognize the pattern. His medical training, combined with emerging research about radium's dangers, led him to the horrifying realization that the glowing foods they had consumed with such delight were slowly killing them. The revelation sent shockwaves through New York society. The same people who had marveled at the glowing cocktails and luminous cake now faced the terrifying reality that their pursuit of novelty and scientific wonder had exposed them to a deadly poison. The dinner party that had seemed like a glimpse of the future had instead become a preview of a very dark fate. Margaret Ashford was among the first to die, her body finally succumbing to the radiation-induced anemia that had been slowly destroying her blood cells. Her death was particularly tragic because she had been so young and vibrant, her life cut short by her enthusiasm for what she thought was harmless scientific progress. Dr. Morrison survived longer, but his final years were marked by increasing pain and disability as the radium continued its destructive work in his bones. He used his remaining time to warn others about radium's dangers, becoming an early advocate for radiation safety despite the personal cost of his advocacy. Senator Crawford's political career ended as his health deteriorated. The man who had once been a powerful force in Washington became a cautionary tale about the dangers of unregulated industrial substances. He died in 1932, 7 years after the dinner party, his death certificate listing bone cancer as the cause. Blackwood's fate was perhaps the most ironic of all. The man who had built his fortune on radium's supposed benefits became one of its most visible victims. His jaw deteriorated so severely that he required multiple surgeries, and his bones became so fragile that he spent his final years largely bedridden. He died in 1931, his body literally glowing with the radium that had accumulated in his bones over years of consumption. The tragedy of the radium dinner party helped catalyze changes in how radioactive materials were regulated and marketed. The deaths of prominent society figures brought public attention to the dangers that radium workers had been experiencing for years, leading to new safety regulations and the eventual ban of radium in consumer products. But the damage had already been done. Hundreds of people had been exposed to dangerous levels of radiation through radium-enhanced products, from the watch dial painters who licked their brushes to shape them, to the wealthy consumers who drank radium water as a health tonic. The glowing dinner party was just one example of how scientific ignorance and commercial greed could combine to create deadly consequences. The story of Blackwood's dinner party serves as a powerful reminder that new technologies and substances can pose hidden dangers that aren't immediately apparent. The guests who consumed those glowing foods thought they were participating in harmless scientific entertainment, never imagining that their pursuit of novelty would cost them their lives. The irony of the situation, that a substance marketed for its health benefits would prove to be one of the most dangerous materials ever consumed by humans, wasn't lost on contemporary observers. The dinner party became a symbol of the dangers of unregulated scientific progress and the need for proper testing and oversight of new technologies. Today, we understand radiation's dangers and have strict regulations governing the use of radioactive materials. But the story of the radium dinner party reminds us that our ancestors' mistakes often seem obvious only in hindsight, and that the pursuit of progress and novelty can sometimes lead us into dangers we don't yet understand. The guests at Blackwood's dinner party thought they were dining on the future. Instead, they were consuming their own deaths, one glowing bite at a time. Chapter 8. The Melamine Milk Scandal. Our final chapter brings us into the modern era to a scandal that shook the world's faith in food safety and demonstrated that even in our age of advanced science and global regulation, the pursuit of profit can still turn basic nutrition into a weapon against the most vulnerable members of society. The year is 2008, and China is preparing to host the Summer Olympics in Beijing. The country is eager to showcase its emergence as a global economic power, its technological advancement, and its ability to provide safe, high-quality products to the world market. Chinese dairy products, in particular, have been gaining international recognition for their quality and affordability. But beneath the surface of this success story, a horrifying deception is taking place. Dairy companies throughout China have been systematically adulterating their milk products with melamine, an industrial chemical used in the production of plastics and fertilizers. The motivation is simple and devastating. Melamine is rich in nitrogen, and standard protein tests measure nitrogen content to determine protein levels in food products. By adding melamine to watered-down milk, unscrupulous producers can make their products appear to have higher protein content while using less actual milk. It's a cost-cutting measure that increases profits while deceiving consumers about the nutritional value of what they're purchasing. What the perpetrators either didn't know or didn't care about was that melamine is toxic to humans, particularly dangerous to infants and young children. The Zhao family in Beijing represents thousands of families who became unwitting victims of this massive fraud. Li Zhao, a young mother, had recently given birth to her first child, a son named Wei. Like millions of Chinese parents, she wanted to give her baby the best possible nutrition, and she had chosen what appeared to be a premium infant formula produced by one of China's most respected dairy companies. The formula was expensive by Chinese standards, but Li and her husband were willing to make the sacrifice for their son's health. The packaging promised complete nutrition, optimal protein content, and all the vitamins and minerals a growing baby needed. The company's advertisements featured healthy, happy babies and reassuring messages about quality and safety. What Li didn't know was that the formula she was feeding her son contained dangerous levels of melamine that had been added to mask the fact that the product had been diluted with water to reduce costs. Every bottle she prepared with love and care was slowly poisoning her child, causing kidney stones to form in his tiny organs. The first signs of trouble appeared when Wei was just 3 months old. He began experiencing difficulty urinating, crying inconsolably during what should have been routine diaper changes. Li initially attributed these symptoms to normal infant discomfort, but as they worsened, she became increasingly concerned. When she took Wei to the pediatrician, the doctor was initially puzzled by the baby's symptoms. Kidney stones in infants were extremely rare, and the doctor had never seen a case in such a young child. Blood tests revealed elevated levels of creatinine and other markers of kidney dysfunction, but the cause remained mysterious. Li wasn't alone in her concerns. Across China, parents were reporting similar symptoms in their infants: difficulty urinating, blood in urine, irritability, and failure to thrive. Pediatric hospitals began seeing an unprecedented number of babies with kidney problems, but the connection to contaminated formula wasn't immediately recognized. The scale of the contamination was staggering. The melamine wasn't limited to a single brand or a single batch of products. It was widespread throughout China's dairy industry, affecting everything from infant formula to liquid milk to yogurt. The contamination had been going on for years, with some estimates suggesting that melamine had been routinely added to dairy products since at least 2005. Dr. Wang Minghua, a pediatric nephrologist at Beijing Children's Hospital, was among the first to recognize the pattern. As more and more infants arrived at his hospital with similar kidney problems, he began investigating what they might have in common. The connection to infant formula became clear when he realized that almost all of the affected babies had been fed products from the same group of manufacturers. The breakthrough came when laboratory tests finally identified melamine in samples of the contaminated formula. The levels were shocking. Some products contained melamine concentrations hundreds of times higher than what would be considered safe for human consumption. The chemical had been added in such quantities that it was essentially turning infant formula into a slow-acting poison. The Zhao family's nightmare deepened when Wei's condition deteriorated rapidly. The kidney stones caused by melamine consumption had grown large enough to block his urinary tract, requiring emergency surgery to remove them. The procedure was risky for such a young infant, and the long-term effects on his kidney function remained uncertain. Li's anguish was compounded by guilt and rage. She had thought she was giving her son the best possible nutrition, carefully following the formula preparation instructions and spending money the family could barely afford on what she believed was a premium product. Instead, she had been unknowingly poisoning her child with every feeding. The scandal broke publicly in September 2008, just weeks after the conclusion of the Beijing Olympics. The timing was particularly devastating for China's international reputation. The country that had just showcased its modernity and competence to the world was now revealed to have a food safety system so compromised that its own infants were being poisoned by basic nutrition products. The numbers were staggering. Nearly 300,000 infants and young children were affected by melamine-contaminated dairy products. Of these, approximately 54,000 required hospitalization for kidney problems, and at least 6 babies died from kidney failure directly attributed to melamine poisoning. The true number of victims may never be known, as many cases went undiagnosed or unreported. The contamination wasn't limited to infant formula. Melamine was found in a wide range of dairy products, including milk powder used in ice cream, chocolate, and other processed foods. The chemical had infiltrated the food supply so thoroughly that products containing Chinese dairy ingredients were recalled from markets around the world. The international response was swift and severe. Countries throughout Asia, Europe, and North America banned imports of Chinese dairy products and began testing other Chinese food exports for contamination. The scandal damaged China's reputation as a food exporter and led to increased scrutiny of Chinese manufacturing practices across all industries. The Chinese government's response revealed the extent of the corruption and negligence that had allowed the contamination to occur. Investigations uncovered a network of dairy farmers, middlemen, and company executives who had knowingly participated in the melamine adulteration scheme. The motivation was purely financial. Melamine cost a fraction of what real protein would cost, and the savings were enormous when applied across millions of tons of dairy products. The legal consequences were severe, but came too late for the victims. Several company executives were sentenced to death, others received life imprisonment, and dozens more were given lengthy prison terms. The companies involved faced massive fines and were forced to pay compensation to victims' families, though no amount of money could undo the damage to the children's health. For the Zhao family, the aftermath of the scandal brought both relief and ongoing challenges. Wei survived his surgery and his kidney function gradually improved, but doctors warned that he might face kidney problems throughout his life as a result of his early exposure to melamine. Li struggled with depression and anxiety, haunted by the knowledge that her attempts to nourish her son had instead harmed him. The melamine scandal led to significant reforms in China's food safety system, including new regulations, increased testing, and harsher penalties for food adulteration. The government established new oversight agencies and implemented stricter quality control measures throughout the dairy industry. But the scandal also revealed deeper problems with China's rapid industrialization and the prioritization of economic growth over public safety. The melamine contamination wasn't the result of a single bad actor or an isolated incident. It was the product of systemic problems that had allowed profit motives to override basic safety considerations. The international implications of the scandal extended far beyond dairy products. It raised questions about the safety of the global food supply chain and the challenges of regulating food production in an interconnected world economy. Consumers worldwide began to pay more attention to the origin of their food and the safety standards of the countries that produced it. The melamine milk scandal serves as a stark reminder that even in our modern era of advanced food science and global regulation, the most basic foods can become dangerous when profit is prioritized over safety. The victims were the most vulnerable members of society, infants who depended entirely on adults to provide them with safe nutrition. The tragedy of the melamine scandal is that it was entirely preventable. The dangers of melamine consumption were well known, and the technology to detect its presence in food products was readily available. The contamination occurred not because of ignorance or accident, but because of deliberate decisions to prioritize short-term profits over human health. For parents like Li Jiao, the scandal shattered their trust in the food system and their confidence in their ability to protect their children. The simple act of feeding a baby, one of the most basic expressions of parental love and care, had been transformed into a source of danger and guilt. The melamine milk scandal reminds us that the safety of our food supply depends not just on technology and regulation, but on the integrity and ethics of the people who produce, process, and distribute our food. When that integrity is compromised, even the most basic nutrition can become a weapon against those who trust it most. Conclusion: lessons from history's table. As we reach the end of our journey through history's most dangerous meals, it's worth reflecting on what these stories tell us about human nature, our relationship with food, and the eternal tension between innovation and safety that has shaped our culinary evolution. Each of the disasters we've explored, from the Roman senator's mushroom feast to the melamine milk scandal, shares common threads that reveal uncomfortable truths about how we approach food, risk, and responsibility. These weren't random accidents or acts of nature, but the predictable results of human choices. The pursuit of novelty over safety, profit over ethics, and convenience over caution. The Roman banquet that became a bloodbath reminds us that the desire for exotic experiences can blind us to obvious dangers. Marcus Flavius's guests were so eager to taste something new and impressive that they ignored the basic principle that unfamiliar foods might be unsafe. Their tragedy echoes in every modern food trend that prioritizes Instagram-worthy presentation over proven safety. The fugu dinner in feudal Japan illustrates how cultural traditions and professional pride can create dangerous blind spots. MasterChef Takeshi's confidence in his skills led him to take risks that no amount of expertise could fully mitigate. His story resonates with every chef, food producer, or home cook who has ever pushed boundaries without fully considering the consequences. The Borgia's Poisoned Feast shows us how food can become a weapon when power and paranoia intersect. Cardinal Ferrari's attempt to eliminate his rivals through contaminated wine backfired catastrophically, demonstrating that when we weaponize food, we lose control over who becomes a victim. This lesson remains relevant in our age of food terrorism fears and supply chain vulnerabilities. The Ergot epidemic of Salem reveals how contaminated food can distort not just individual health, but entire communities' perception of reality. The residents of Salem Village never realized that their daily bread was poisoning their minds, leading them to attribute supernatural causes to what was actually a biological phenomenon. Their experience warns us about the hidden dangers that can lurk in our most basic foods. The Great Molasses Flood demonstrates how industrial food production can pose unexpected dangers to entire communities. The residents of Boston's North End had no idea that living next to a massive tank of industrial molasses put them at risk. Just as many communities today remain unaware of the potential hazards posed by nearby food processing facilities. The tragedy of Minamata shows us how environmental contamination can transform traditional food sources into instruments of slow death. The fishing families who had sustained themselves from the bay for generations had no way of detecting the invisible mercury that was accumulating in their daily catch. Their story foreshadows our modern concerns about microplastics, pesticide residues, and other invisible contaminants in our food supply. The Radium dinner party of the 1920s illustrates how scientific ignorance, combined with commercial enthusiasm, can turn supposed health foods into deadly poisons. The wealthy New Yorkers who consumed glowing foods thought they were embracing the future of nutrition, never imagining that their pursuit of scientific novelty would cost them their lives. Finally, the Melamine milk scandal reminds us that even in our modern era of advanced food science and global regulation, the most basic foods can become dangerous when profit is prioritized over safety. The Chinese infants who were poisoned by contaminated formula were victims not of ignorance or accident, but of deliberate decisions to cut costs at the expense of human health. What do these stories teach us about navigating our own relationship with food in the 21st century? First, they remind us that novelty and tradition both carry risks. The Roman senator's exotic mushrooms and the Japanese master's perfectly prepared fugu were both dangerous, but so were the traditional rye bread of Salem and the generational fishing practices of Minamata. Safety requires constant vigilance, regardless of whether we're trying something new or sticking with familiar foods. Second, these stories highlight the importance of understanding our food systems. The victims in each case were harmed partly because they didn't understand where their food came from, how it was produced, or what risks it might carry. In our modern world of complex global supply chains and industrial food production, this understanding is more challenging but more crucial than ever. Third, these disasters demonstrate that food safety is ultimately a social and political issue, not just a technical one. The Melamine scandal, the Minamata contamination, and the Molasses flood all occurred because regulatory systems failed to protect public health from corporate negligence. Technical solutions to food safety problems are meaningless without the social and political will to implement and enforce them. Fourth, these stories remind us that the most vulnerable members of society, children, the poor, and those dependent on local food sources, often bear the greatest burden when food systems fail. From the infants poisoned by melamine formula to the fishing families of Minamata, those with the least power to protect themselves suffer the most when others make dangerous choices about food production and distribution. Finally, these historical disasters teach us that the price of food safety is eternal vigilance. Each generation must learn anew the lessons that previous generations paid for in blood, because the specific risks change even as the underlying human tendencies that create them remain constant. As you sit down to your next meal, remember the stories we've shared tonight. Not to make you paranoid about every bite, but to remind you that the food on your plate represents a complex web of choices made by farmers, processors, regulators, and retailers. Your safety depends not just on your own decisions, but on the integrity and competence of countless people you'll never meet. The most dangerous meals in history weren't dangerous because they were exotic or unusual. They were dangerous because someone, somewhere in the chain from farm to table, made a choice that prioritized something else over the safety of the people who would ultimately consume the food. Whether that choice was driven by ignorance, greed, pride, or desperation, the result was the same. Meals that should have nourished instead became instruments of harm. In our modern world, we have better tools than ever before to ensure food safety. Advanced testing methods, global communication systems, sophisticated regulatory frameworks, and scientific understanding that our ancestors could never have imagined. But we also have new challenges. Global supply chains that can spread contamination across continents in days, industrial-scale production that can amplify small mistakes into massive disasters, and economic pressures that can tempt producers to cut corners in ways that compromise safety. The stories we've shared tonight remind us that food safety isn't something we can take for granted or assume someone else will handle. It requires active participation from everyone in the food system, from the farmers who grow our food to the consumers who eat it. It requires asking questions about where our food comes from, how it's produced, and what risks it might carry. It requires supporting regulatory systems that prioritize public health over corporate profits. And it requires remembering that every meal is a small act of trust. Trust that the people who produced, processed, and prepared our food have done so with our safety in mind. The most dangerous meals in history teach us that this trust, while necessary, should never be blind. Our ancestors paid a terrible price to learn these lessons. The least we can do is remember their stories and apply their hard-won wisdom to our own choices about what we eat and how we ensure the safety of our food supply. So the next time you sit down to a meal, take a moment to appreciate not just the flavors and nutrition it provides, but also the complex system of trust, regulation, and care that brought it safely to your table. And remember that maintaining that safety is not just the responsibility of farmers, processors, and regulators. It's a responsibility we all share as participants in the global food system. The most dangerous meals in history remind us that food is never just about nutrition or pleasure. It's about the choices we make as individuals and as a society, about what risks we're willing to accept and what prices we're willing to pay for safety. May we choose wisely, and may the lessons learned from history's table help us create a safer, more trustworthy food system for future generations. Thank you for joining me on this journey through culinary history's darker chapters. Until next time, eat well, eat safely, and remember the stories of those who came before us. Their experiences, tragic as they were, can help ensure that our own meals remain sources of nourishment and pleasure rather than danger and regret. Sweet dreams, and may your next meal be both delicious and safe.